Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on Nutrigenomix, eating according to your genes. I am Kori. I am a registered dietitian as well as a mindfulness coach for eating mindfully to help nourish your body. So you may wonder how this relates to mindfulness, and some of you might think this is actually counterintuitive to eating mindfully. Uh, but this is a very exciting, non-invasive test. You just kind of swab your cheek and send this sample in to get the report from Nutrigenomix. And the reason why I like using this in mindfulness is sometimes I find people need a little bit more of a template or a little bit more individualized nutrition therapy, and as well as some screening for some things that might be going on, if it's their digestion, their skin, their fertility, their fitness. And this sort of helps to look at some of the things that might be going on in terms of genetics and risk and susceptibility. So it can help to kind of guide us a little bit further. So I always kind of get to know people before we do these tests and make sure that they're going to be used appropriately. And so I'm excited to share some information with you today on how I've used this test to help with individualizing nutrition therapy for clients that I've been working with. So not everything on here is going to apply to everyone, but I wanted to give you a high level of what these tests can do. And there are different tests, so I will go through that in this presentation as well. So we'll touch a little bit on the science of nutrigenomics, as well as about the test and the company, and how this applies and sort of resorts to quality and why it matters. And of course, we'll go through the reports and some of the other features of this test as well. So what makes this test so special? There are, allergy tests and sensitivity tests and lots of different things we can do. There's different genetic tests that we can do. And this research is actually Toronto-based. There are a lot of researchers on the team from Canada and beyond. And I'm really excited about this research because it is Canadian and all the testing is done and housed in Canada as well. So nothing goes outside the borders here. But it can also be performed for people who are international as well. So if you're not residing in Canada, you can also complete this testing as well. The way the test works is it's very targeted based on certain genetic markers that get picked up through your genetic swab. And they guarantee the privacy and security of all of your information. Everything gets coded and kept separate so that it's very secure and safe moving forward, so that you don't have to worry about that. There are very stringent laboratory standards that are followed with the testing. Again, so everything is at the highest level for you to know that this test is safe and ready for you to use. Okay, so I think this is the more exciting, the science behind the personalized nutrition and how this can be applied for behavior change and using it through that non-diet and more mindfulness mentality as well. So when we look at individualized nutrition therapy and behavior change, we know through looking at some of the studies, and there's some of them referenced there for you in the bottom right, that when people receive sort of this DNA-based dietary counseling versus just very generic public health recommendations, that added individualization can actually have a very positive effect to dietary behavior changes. And it also helps to individualize the information so that clients, individuals understand it on their own needs, and it'll help with, again, just individualizing that therapy and that information. And I think it also helps to take a lot of information and sort of target in on what is the information that you need to know. So there's nice to know, and then there's need to know. And I think there's so much nice to know information. Sometimes it's contradictory as well. So if you're really feeling confused, this is a type of report that can just kind of help streamline a lot of that information and give you just a few things to really focus on. So we'll talk about what this report does in terms of that information. So let's talk about the results. So you do this cheek swab, you send the cheek swab in, and then you get this report. So when you get the report back, it is something that I will review with you and explain to you how to interpret the information and also just making sure that you're using it to facilitate behavior change and not to misuse the information. So here are all the things that get included in your report. So no matter what report you choose to do, all of these things get included. So there is this section on cardiometabolic health. So what that means is if you have an increased risk for heart disease, hypertension, anything cardiometabolic health related, blood sugar management, this will get picked up in the test, and it gives you kind of like behavior focus of what to focus in on to help with reducing that risk. So just because the gene is there, it doesn't mean that you will necessarily go on to develop these things, but it's just something to be conscious of. What things can I do that are more specific to my own needs based on my genetics, okay? Nutrient metabolism. So if you are at a higher risk genetically for whether it's a malabsorption or a deficiency, this will get picked up in this report as well. So there's a whole host of vitamins and minerals on the report. And again, they flag on the report which ones you're at higher risk for this nutrient metabolism deficiency. Okay, there's a section on food intolerances. So if it's gluten, lactose, caffeine, it will show you what your predisposition is to intolerances there. And I'll talk a little bit more about gluten, as well as eating habits. So genetically, we can be wired for having a sugar preference, a fat preference, more snacking type behaviors. And so this report will pick up and see sort of what eating behaviors you might be more predisposed to. And what I find so helpful about this is sometimes it's just kind of reaffirming that it's not necessarily you that are doing something wrong. It's just maybe what you're more hardwired for. And so it can help to navigate some changes and shifts in awareness. There's where the mindfulness can come into this to better support you in those changes that you're trying to make. The other section on here, and there's a more specific report for those who live a very active lifestyle or in sports or fitness, is it will also give you a few injuries that you are maybe more prone and susceptible to based on your genetics as well. And then some ways, again, to mitigate that risk. So what types of things could you try to do that will help with that? There's also a physical activity section, and I found this one really fascinating when I was looking at my own results, is it shows what types of activities that you are more genetically predisposed to having kind of like this advantage if you're doing more of those types of activities and how your body responds to it. Whether you're someone who genetically is more likely to be motivated to do exercise or not, or movement. And so I found this section really helpful to kind of see what genetically my body is more advantaged with and what types of movement, as well as if I had any injury risks for shoulder or Achilles tendon, and then what types of activities would be helpful for me to incorporate so that I'm not increasing that risk further. So these are all kind of the different categories. When you get your report, it lists these out as kind of the headings, and then underneath each one of these, there's a whole section of different results that we get into. And I'll show you what it looks like at the end, the report, so you can get a feel for how it's set up. So let's talk a little bit more about nutrient metabolism. So I'm just going to give you an example of what information you would get from this section on your report. So one of the nutrients is vitamin B12, which is a very interesting vitamin, one of my favorites. When people have low levels of B12, visually it can look as something pale appearance or mood-wise, a lot of irritability. Ensuring sufficient levels helps with healthy brain and nervous system functioning. And so when there's deficiency, this can cause like the fogginess, or sometimes people get like tingly as well symptoms, which can be later signs of a very severe deficiency. And it also can cause depression, mental health, sort of mimicking symptoms as well. So in order to ensure you're getting adequate intake, it's really important for vitamin B12 because it's also utilized to help other nutrients metabolize and be absorbed properly as well. So in the report, you'll see the variant FUT. FUT2 is the gene that we take the sample and see if it's listed there. And so if the gene is present, then it means that you could have a higher risk than the average population for developing a B12 deficiency, especially when intake is not adequate. So this is kind of cool on the report. It will show you what foods have vitamin B12 and sort of the quantity, so you can see if you can't meet this. We always try to meet it through our dietary intake. That then supplementation might be indicated, and it might be an indication for you to go and get some blood work done, especially for people who are vegetarian, vegan, or like I said, if they're not eating those high sources of vitamin B12 daily. It might be one of those vitamins that you get screened through your blood work yearly as well. So I'll show you again on the report a little bit later what to expect and what you would see on the report for, let's say, a vitamin. The other thing to note here too is that when you complete the report, you have an option of completing a food frequency questionnaire, and that will pick up just generally, it's not perfect, but it will help to see on average if you're meeting your vitamin and mineral, as well as even your macronutrients, so carbohydrates, protein, fats, based on kind of the foods that you are consuming more frequently. So it's not perfect, but again, just kind of gives you that average if you're meeting your intake, and if not, where the gaps are for you. So again, it'll just help you to narrow in on what things to focus more on. So food intolerances and sensitivities, I mentioned earlier, which ones are on the report. Gluten is, of course, on here. So if you have the gene, you could have a predisposition for either a gluten intolerance, which is different from celiac disease. So celiac disease is an autoimmune disease where it's a severe form of gluten intolerance, and 1% of the population have celiac disease. And the only way to treat that disease is by a lifetime of no gluten in your diet. Now, there's also this non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is not celiac, but people who are still consuming gluten find that they have some of these symptoms. So you may screen negative on if you have to do a small bowel follow through and do a biopsy, or if you're doing the blood work for celiac disease, those might come back negative, but people will still say, I swear, every time I eat gluten foods, I get a reaction. So this is that kind of gray area where you might fall under that non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Okay, so gluten intolerance could be celiac disease, that autoimmune disease, or it could be this non-celiac gluten sensitivity that you might have. So when you have celiac disease, you have these little, we call them villi in your small intestine. And when you eat gluten, because it's an autoimmune disease, what happens is the body attacks itself. And so these little villi get wiped out. So when you go to do the biopsy, that's what they're looking for. They're looking to see if you have the villi or if they've been wiped out. So this is why it's really important to go and get tested from your doctor if you're suspicious, because if you eliminate gluten from your diet, very quickly these villi can grow back. And so if you go to see a gastroenterologist and they go to do your biopsy or even the blood work, sometimes these can be false negatives because you've already created some of that healing by eliminating. And it's much harder to go back because you have to eat gluten-free for 12 weeks in order for those villi to get wiped out again. And it can be really hard to go back and do that because you've created some healing and it feels good. So to go back and put gluten in your diet can be really hard to go back and do. So if you notice any of these symptoms, they're very vague, but you could pinpoint when you're having gluten-containing food. If you're just feeling really tired all the time, you're achy, like a joint pain, it's almost like this arthritic pain, or if you're getting skin rashes and it can kind of come patchy, come and go, or over the long term, if you're noticing you're deficient in things like iron, and again, in the long term too, if it's not treated, it can contribute to leaching from the bones, so osteoporosis of calcium. So in the actual test result, it will show your risk if it's low, medium, or high for this gluten intolerance, whether it's celiac or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So interesting to note, people who have celiac disease, 99% have this gene. So that's interesting to find, like 99% of people who have celiac disease have this gene. 60% who have non-celiac gluten sensitivity have this gene, as compared to only 30% of the general population who don't have celiac or gluten sensitivity will have this gene. So the odds are sort of leaning towards, if this does show up on your genetic test, that you're more likely to be predisposed to some type of gluten intolerance. So this is something I would talk to you about, your risk and what to do with this information and how to work with your doctor to figure out if it's celiac or not. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about cardiometabolic health. So there are certain types of foods, whether it's caffeine, sodium, or different types of fats in your diet, which come up in the report as well. And this slide is specific to caffeine and its influence on our heart health. So some people are just more predisposed, higher risk of blood pressure and heart disease, like heart attack, if they consume more than 2 cups of coffee per day. Others in the general population don't seem to have this same risk. So if you have this variant of this gene on the screen here, you are at a higher risk of being that person who has an increased risk of heart disease when you consume more than the 2 cups of coffee per day. So what's the implication here? It would be obviously to limit your caffeine intake. And again, you could look at your food frequency and see on average, if it's Saturday morning and you have that extra cup of coffee, it's maybe not going to have a huge risk factor increaser there. But if this is something you're having, 3, 4, 5 cups of coffee a day, that may increase your risk. Now, I want you to keep in mind too, I don't have a coffee cup, I have a water glass, but this is like a 10-ounce cup. So when you go and get a large coffee, remember 1 cup is considered 6 ounces. So a large coffee could be 1.5 to 2 cups of coffee already just in that 1 cup. So just remembering that too, that the actual serving sizes that you're having may not necessarily line up to that. So very easy, if you have 2 large coffees a day, that could be more than 3 or 4 cups of coffee per day. Okay, so the other interesting one on this test here is your sugar preference. And so we know if you're having higher intakes of sugar, there's obviously an increased risk for different types of diseases, heart disease, diabetes. And so when you have this gene, the GLUT2 gene, it's a variant of it, people who kind of have this super taster response to sugar and want it and crave it, and have, the body lights up a little bit more when you have a taste preference for sugary foods. So obviously the implication here is just being aware of that genetically you're just more hardwired for sweeter foods. And so again, taking the blame off yourself, it's nothing you're doing or not doing. It's just genetically, you can taste these foods that much better and crave them and want them. So trying to, figure out a way when you're working with a dietitian on how to manage that. So there's where the mindful and intuitive eating can come into play. It's learning to nourish your food, and sort of how to eat food in a way that sort of satisfies rather than trying to restrict and take out, because your body is going to retaliate and want. Okay, so the other section I mentioned is exercise physiology, fitness, and injury risk. So, a few things to note when we say fitness, fitness is really a measure of how well your heart and your lungs and your muscles all work together. It is not necessarily as the last image. That is not what fitness looks like. It is something internal. It's how well you can, go up a flight of stairs without losing your breath. So that is actually what fitness is. Exercise is when we do something that's structured, like this type of movement. If you're doing stretches or going to the gym or doing an activity, we consider that exercise. But physical activity is just how you move your body. So exercise may fall into there, parking your car a little bit further away, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, finding ways to move your body that your body is able to do. Those are all forms of movement. So that's just the difference between that. And the genes that are in this test look at things like power and strength. So if your body prefers these types of movements or responds really well to it, which can help with regulating our blood sugar, our brain health, our posture, help us with our health goals, this will be picked up in this test as well. And so the genetic advantage you have when you're doing these like power and strength sports or movements, you may notice you actually feel the impact more so than somebody else would in the general population. So I had someone yesterday I was reviewing the report with, and they are someone who respond really well to power and strength exercises, and they just notice they feel so good when they're doing them, and they can notice very quickly when they stop, they don't have that same feeling. So just something fun to kind of be aware of if you have that gene, to make sure you include those activities in your movement. So that was a little bit of a snapshot of the test. And just to show you how easy this test is, it's something you can do right from home. It's a 5-step process. There's a couple of ways to do it where you get the kit mailed right to your house. And it looks like this. So you just have to fill up right to this line here by doing your sample collection. Once you're done and you follow the instructions for the cheek swab, then you put it in the envelope. It comes with a postage marked envelope. It gets sent to the lab. Your results get uploaded, and then together we go through your report, and sort of look at what the information is available in the report and how it applies to your lifestyle and things that we can work towards helping you implement depending on your goals. So this whole process can take about 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how quickly the mail works in our favor and how quickly you can get the samples sent back. And then usually the report gets loaded up within 2 weeks and we can review it together. So there are a few different reports depending on where you're at in your life and what your goals are. So one of them is just this kind of general health report. So it goes through all of the things that we just went over in terms of cardiometabolic health, food intolerances and sensitivities, your predisposition for nutrient metabolism. As well, you can do the food frequency questionnaire, and it will give us sort of a look at what you're currently intaking and if there are any gaps, where to zone into. There's also a nutrition performance report. So for those who are very active or into kind of like high level sports, or just have very high fitness levels, this report is really helpful because it'll help fine tune your nutrition to make sure you're fueling efficiently. I was working with someone who is not an athlete, but just a very active older adult, and was under fueling. And so they were noticing that they were losing their power and their strength. And it came through from us doing the reports, as well as what they are more likely to have advantage with their movement. And so we were able to kind of shift things around for them, just based on the information from that report. There's also a report specific for fertility and pregnancy. So if you are planning to get pregnant or are, or having issues with fertility, this might be one a little bit more specific to your needs at that life stage for you. If you are someone who's vegetarian, vegan, and looking to kind of make sure that you are navigating the vitamins and minerals that are important for you for living a plant-based lifestyle, or you're considering, this might be a really good report for you as well to make sure you know for the long term what to focus on. And so this is what a sample report actually looks like and what you will notice on the results. So if you can see over here, this is under the dietary nutrient section. You'll see all the different vitamins and minerals listed. It will show you what the gene is. So not that you need to know this information, and the variant of the gene, as well as what your variant is. And then that will help to determine your risk. So in black, it says typical. In red, you'll see anything that's kind of out of the typical for the general population. So in this case, this person has a elevated risk for having a B12 deficiency and vitamin D deficiency. And then you'll see here it has recommendations. So this is the high level report. You kind of get this like bird's eye view report. And then you also have this detailed section that kind of talks about what each vitamin and mineral are responsible in the body, a little bit about the research in terms of the genes and the variants. I mentioned earlier, it will show you what the food sources are and just the amounts, as well as what's recommended. And then when we do your food frequency questionnaire, it will pick up if this is a vitamin that you have low or high intake of. And so that together we can establish when supplementation is appropriate. So this is just a summary of that bird's eye view, but just gives a little bit more information. And then there's this kind of recommendation here on how to meet your needs if not. So it covers the what, the vitamin D, the why it's so important, where you find vitamin D, how you can make some changes to your meal plans based on that information, and then what are the goals in terms of intake. Okay, so I mentioned there is the food frequency questionnaire. So once you decide that you want to do the report, it gets shipped to your house, then I can email you the food frequency questionnaire that you can fill out. And once you fill that out and your report gets generated, you'll have the actual report of your genetic predisposition and risks. And then you'll also have a report based on your food frequency in terms of what vitamins and minerals may be things to sort of look at in terms of gaps and how we can make some dietary changes there. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. That's all the information I had today for you. If you have any questions or you want to talk a little bit more about this test, I've put here my email, Kori@mindfullynourishedmamas.com. If you're ready to go and you are wanting to get a report shipped to your house, if you scan this code, this will include full payment for your test, as well as an hour spent with me going through your report and then fine-tuning some goals in your lifestyle based on your results. So once you pay for this, you can scan here. Again, within the week, the kit will be mailed right to your house. You'll follow the instructions provided. It will have a return envelope with a stamp. Once you send that back, it's usually a 2-3 turnaround time that we'll have the report, and we'll set up a time to go through the report together. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon here and watching this webinar. And feel free to share with a friend who might find this helpful.